What happens when worldwide fame breaks lives and huge money turns best friends into enemies? We are used to seeing the Beatles smiling on screen, but behind the scenes, they faced harsh firings, deportations, secret marriages, and crazed fans. Today we'll tell you what was really hidden behind the facade of Beatlemania, how the lives unfolded of those who ended up in the band almost by accident, and why the songwriters had to fight for the rights to their own songs for nearly half a century. Let's turn the energy all the way up. Here we go. The story of the Beatles did not begin with applause and spotlights, but under the gray sky of industrial Liverpool, where music was the only way not to disappear into the sameness of working-class neighborhoods. The starting point was October 1940, when John Winston Lennon was born to the howl of German air raid sirens. He grew up at Mendips, a solid house in a respectable neighborhood, where he was raised by his strict Aunt Mimi, who kept telling him that he would never make a living from music.
His college time and missing lectures by wasting his time playing the guitar.
John was a school troublemaker and a class clown, who in 1956 put together his first band, the Quarrymen. On July 6, 1957, a fateful meeting took place. At a church festival, John met 15-year-old Paul McCartney. Paul, whose life in the council houses of Liverpool's Speak district was far more modest, impressed Lennon with his technique. He knew how to tune a guitar and knew the chords to the latest American hits. John was torn between wanting to be the sole leader and recognizing Paul's talent. But 2 weeks later, he still invited McCartney to join the band. In 1958, Paul's school friend, 15-year-old George Harrison, joined the group. At first, 17-year-old Lennon considered him too green, but after Harrison played guitar flawlessly, his place was approved. The fourth member was Stuart Sutcliffe, John's best friend from art college. He was a brilliant painter, but a mediocre musician. Stuart sold one of his paintings for £65 and spent the money on a Hofner bass guitar, essentially buying himself a place in the band. In April 1960, Sutcliffe and Lennon combined Beatles and rhythm, the words Beatles and beat, and ended up with the brand The Beatles. The group began working themselves to exhaustion. They played in pubs and even backed striptease dancers. Their first tour of Scotland was a disaster. Temporary drummer Tommy Moore got into an accident, lost his teeth, and ran off, unable to take Lennon's biting sarcasm. By the summer of 1960, the Beatles had landed a contract in Hamburg, but they still had no permanent drummer.
The solution was found in the basement of a house on Hayman's Green. That was where the Casbah Club was located, owned by Mona Best. Her son, Pete Best, had a powerful drumming style and movie star looks. As a result, on August 12, 1960, he officially joined the lineup, and on August 16, 1960, the five of them set off for Germany in an old van. The musicians settled in Hamburg's Reeperbahn district, crammed into a tiny room that was always damp and smelled like a toilet. To get through 12-hour shifts on the stages of local clubs, for which they were paid a miserable £2.50 a day, the Beatles began taking a pharmacy stimulant supplied to them, among others, by the mother of their new acquaintance, Astrid Kircher. It was in Hamburg that the band's aesthetic revolution took place. Kircher, who became Stuart Sutcliffe's fiancée, persuaded him to be the first to trade his voluminous teddy boy quiff for a haircut with bangs over his forehead. Later, the others adopted the style as well, although Pete Best stayed loyal to his bouffant. Meanwhile, Stuart felt less and less confident on stage. His vocal number was the song Love Me Tender, which sent the girls wild and stirred jealousy in Paul McCartney. Even then, Paul understood that the band needed a real bass player, not an artist holding an instrument. The first German chapter ended in collapse in November 1960. First, George Harrison was deported for working while underage. Then Paul and Pete were deported for disorderly behavior. John Lennon returned to Liverpool alone, while Sutcliffe stayed in Hamburg with Astrid, temporarily leaving the group. In December 1960, the Beatles caused a sensation at Liverpool's Litherland Town Hall. From February 1961 onward, they became the kings of the Cavern Club, where they eventually performed 262 times. During this period, Paul McCartney finally took over the bass guitar from Sutcliffe. In Hamburg, Paul bought his famous violin-shaped Hofner, which he had been saving up for over several months. In the spring of 1961, the band returned to Hamburg, this time to the Top 10 Club. There, they recorded professionally for the first time, backing singer Tony Sheridan on the song My Bonnie.
My Bonnie lies over.
On October 28, 1961, a customer named Kurt Raymond Jones walked into Brian Epstein's NEMS music store and asked for that very record, My Bonnie. That was when Epstein discovered that the band was playing just a couple hundred yards from his office. By December, he had become their manager, setting his commission at 25%, and then began an aggressive cleanup of their image. No leather jackets or jeans on stage, only expensive suits. Meanwhile, dramatic changes were taking place in the band members' lives. On April 10, 1962, 21-year-old Stuart Sutcliffe died in Hamburg from a brain hemorrhage. Soon after, Lennon's girlfriend Cynthia Powell became pregnant, and in August, they married in secret. Epstein paid for the wedding lunch, but insisted that the marriage be kept secret so it would not scare off female fans. The decisive breakthrough came in June 1962, when producer George Martin of Parlophone Records agreed to record the band, but set one strict condition. They had to replace the drummer. John, Paul, and George, who had long been unhappy with Pete Best's technique, decided to use it as a reason to fire him, but the fans were furious. Pete was the most popular member. Best was replaced by Ringo Starr from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He already had experience playing with the Beatles in Hamburg, and he fit perfectly into their inner rhythm. On October 5, 1962, their first official single, Love Me Do, was released.
Love me do. You know I love you.
And reached number 17 on the charts. Their second single, Please Please Me,
You don't need me to show the way, love.
released on January 11, 1963, shot to the top of the British charts within weeks and set the machinery of Beatlemania in motion. To lock in the success of the single, Epstein and Martin needed a full album, but the band had no time for long recording sessions. In the end, the Fab Four did the impossible. The entire album, Please Please Me,
You don't need me to show.
was recorded in one 10-hour session on February 11, 1963. By the end of the day, John Lennon's voice was practically gone, but that was exactly what gave the final track, Twist and Shout,
You got me going now.
its wild, raspy drive, the kind that became a rock and roll benchmark. The record, released in March, topped the charts for an incredible 30 weeks, until it was replaced by their own second album. Against the backdrop of this musical triumph, the members' personal lives turned into a spy thriller. On April 8, 1963, John and Cynthia's son Julian was born. To avoid destroying the image of a single idol, John was forced to hide his family, visiting his wife and son almost in secret. Paul McCartney was also going through changes at the time. After breaking off his engagement to his first serious girlfriend, Dot Roan, he met 17-year-old actress Jane Asher in May 1963. That relationship became Paul's ticket into London's higher cultural circles. He moved into the Asher family home on Wimpole Street, where, under the influence of her mother, a music teacher, he began studying classical harmonies, something that would soon radically change the band's sound. That same year, Brian Epstein and music publisher Dick James founded the company Northern Songs to publish Lennon and McCartney songs. At first, John and Paul each owned only 20% of the shares in their own music, but at the time, the songwriters were more concerned with breaking through the crowds outside club entrances. Meanwhile, in October, after the band's performance at the London Palladium, when fan hysteria brought traffic in the city center to a standstill, the term Beatlemania officially entered common use. At the end of November, the second album, With the Beatles, was released, showing that the group was growing technically. It also marked George Harrison's debut as a songwriter with Don't Bother Me.
By the beginning of 1964, the Beatles had become Britain's most valuable export. While the single I Want to Hold Your Hand was storming the American charts, Brian Epstein was preparing an operation that would later be called the British Invasion. On February 7, 1964, The four of them landed at New York's Kennedy Airport. They were met by 10,000 screaming fans, and that was only the beginning. 2 days later, the band appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. The event drew a record 73 million viewers to their screens, more than a third of the U.S. population at the time. City streets literally emptied out. The crime rate during those hours dropped almost to zero, because even robbers were sitting in front of their televisions. In April 1964, the band set a historic record. The top 5 spots on the Billboard Hot 100 were all occupied by Beatles songs.
Music history had never seen such domination by a single brand, and it will probably never see it again. While Beatlemania was spiraling out of control, the band began moving into the film market. A Hard Day's Night became not only a profitable business project, earning $14 million on a budget of $350,000, but also a turning point of personal change for the members. It was on the movie set in March 1964 that George Harrison met 19-year-old model Patty Boyd and jokingly asked her to marry him. In June 1964, the band set off on a world tour that included Denmark, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, and Australia. But just before the flight, Ringo Starr came down with acute tonsillitis and pharyngitis. Epstein, unwilling to jeopardize the contract, insisted on a temporary replacement. That is how drummer Jimmy Nicol appeared in the band's history for 10 days.
Nicol put on Ringo's suit, which had to be altered to fit him, and suddenly found himself at the center of the madness. Ringo, lying in the hospital, seriously feared he would be replaced forever. But he returned to the lineup in Melbourne, where the crowd of fans reached an incredible 300,000 people. In August 1964, another event took place that changed the band's inner chemistry. In a New York hotel, Bob Dylan introduced the Beatles to banned substances, which influenced the group's creativity. At the end of the year, the band released the album Beatles for Sale, and the song I'm a Loser became the first song that clearly reflected Dylan's influence. John Lennon admitted weakness, fear, and failure for the first time, instead of singing about victories on the romantic front. The band's financial situation during this period was paradoxical.
On the one hand, their singles were selling in the millions, and the fee for one concert in Kansas City was an astronomical $150,000. On the other hand, they were losing enormous sums because of poorly signed contracts. By 1965, Beatlemania had reached its peak. The musicians became prisoners of hotels, moving between stadiums in armored vans, while an ocean of fan hysteria raged outside. Ringo Starr later recalled that in those years he stopped hearing himself on stage. Because of the screaming crowd, he could only follow the movements of John's and Paul's backs. On August 15, 1965, at New York's Shea Stadium, the band made a bold financial statement in the show business of that era. 55,000 spectators and an incredible fee of $304,000 for one evening. Behind the scenes of this madness, the members' personal lives were growing new relationships and assets. In February 1965, Ringo Starr married 18-year-old hairdresser Maureen Cox. Their wedding was just as rushed and secret as Lennon's had once been. Within a few years, they had become parents of 3 children: sons Zach and Jason, and daughter Lee. Meanwhile, John was already settling fully into his Kenwood estate, where Cynthia continued to play the role of the invisible wife, hiding from female fans. In June 1965, the Queen awarded the 4 of them Orders of the British Empire. This caused a wave of protests among war veterans who returned their medals because they did not want to stand in the same ranks as pop musicians. 4 years later, John Lennon would return his own medal in protest against Britain's foreign policy. On August 6th, the album Help was released, becoming the first rock album to receive a Grammy nomination in the Album of the Year category. It featured the legendary Yesterday, the only track with just Paul McCartney's voice and guitar. The composition not only went down in history as one of the band's most famous works, but was also recognized as the most covered song in music history. According to the Guinness World Records, more than 2,200 cover versions have been created. In January 1966, George Harrison finally married model Patty Boyd. Their marriage looked perfect, but even then, George had begun seeking comfort in religion and later in alcohol.
which would destroy the union years later. In March of that same year, Paul McCartney bought a house at 7 Cavendish Avenue for £40,000. This mansion in St. John's Wood became his fortress, where he could experiment with avant-garde and classical music, while John was hanging out at his country home, Kenwood. Meanwhile, starting with the album Rubber Soul, the style of the Beatles' songs began to change. Under the influence of banned substances, the songwriters gradually moved from light romance to philosophical lyrics and a more complex sound. The Beatles continued their creative experiments on the album Revolver, released in August of 1966. Yellow Submarine stood out here.
Yellow submarine, yellow submarine.
It was written specifically for Ringo Starr. It became his only British #1 hit as lead vocalist and formed the basis for the animated film of the same name. Alongside it on the single came Eleanor Rigby,
All the lonely people.
which featured a string ensemble, while none of the Beatles played musical instruments on the recording. On August 29, 1966, the Beatles' last official concert took place at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The group made a decision. They would no longer be wax figures in arenas where their music could not be heard over the screams. They locked themselves inside Abbey Road Studios and began work on the album Sgt.
Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which took an incredible 700 hours and about 25,000 pounds to record. It was McCartney's project. He suggested that the band hide behind the masks of a fictional orchestra to lift the burden of expectations. The Beatles worked on the psychedelic masterpiece, Strawberry Fields Forever,
Strawberry fields forever.
and producer George Martin had to splice together two versions of the song, recorded in different keys and at different tempos. The album became a cultural explosion, bringing together rock and symphonic music, and won 4 Grammys. Its cover cost £1,200, far more than the recording of their entire first album. In June 1967, the Beatles cemented their status as global prophets by performing All You Need Is Love
All you need is love.
during the world's first satellite broadcast for 400 million viewers. But the triumph did not last long. On August 27, 1967, Brian Epstein died at the age of 32. The official cause was an overdose of sleeping pills. For the group, it was the loss of their navigator. Brian not only handled their finances, but also diffused internal conflicts. Their first independent project without Brian, the film Magical Mystery Tour, became their first serious failure. Critics tore apart the amateurish piece of work, and its black and white TV broadcast killed the entire psychedelic look of the frame. In early 1968, after returning to London from a spiritual reset in India, the group created the corporation Apple Corps. The idea of business as art turned out in practice to be a bottomless money pit. While the Beatles were opening the Apple boutique on Baker Street, their own relationships were falling apart at the seams. In May '68, Yoko Ono entered John's life. While Cynthia Lennon was on vacation, John invited Yoko to his Kenwood estate, where they recorded the experimental album Two Virgins in a single night. When Cynthia returned, she found Yoko in her robe, drinking tea with her husband. Divorce was inevitable, and it cost John £100,000 and the loss of custody of his son Julian. Yoko's appearance at Abbey Road Studios broke the group's unspoken rule of no wives and irritated Paul and George. The recording of the White Album in 1968 became a chronicle of the band's breakup. The tension was so great that Ringo Starr officially left the group for 2 weeks, saying he no longer felt needed. In his absence, Paul sat down at the drums himself, recording the parts for Back in the USSR
Back in the US, back in the US, back.
and Dear Prudence. Against the backdrop of creative and personal chaos, the band released its best-selling single, Hey Jude.
Paul wrote it under the working title, Hey Jules, to comfort John's young son Julian during his parents' divorce. The 7-minute composition became, at that time, the longest song ever to top the charts. Paul's personal life also took a sharp turn at that moment. His 5-year relationship with Jane Asher ended in an instant when Jane came home and found him in bed with American Francie Schwartz. Soon, Paul shifted his attention to photographer Linda Eastman, whom he had met at the presentation of the album Sgt. Pepper. Linda became not just his wife, but his ally in the coming battle for the band's legacy. January 1969 began with the disastrous sessions for the Get Back project, which later became the album Let It Be. The musicians rehearsed in a cold Twickenham film studio under the gaze of movie cameras.
John was heavily using banned substances and showed little interest in the work, while George, after yet another lecture from McCartney on how he should play, simply got up and left the band for several days. The situation was temporarily saved by keyboardist Billy Preston, whom George brought into the studio as a peacemaker. In the presence of an outsider, the Beatles stopped arguing and started playing. The final chord of their public life was the improvised concert on the roof of the Apple office on January 30th, 1969. On a freezing London afternoon, the four of them delivered that same drive one last time, the energy that had once begun in Hamburg. The police stopped the performance after 40 minutes, and Lennon, leaving the stage, threw out his famous line, "I hope we pass the audition."
By the summer of 1969, the Beatles' approaching breakup was obvious. But paradoxically, it was at exactly this time that they created one of their greatest masterpieces, the album Abbey Road. The recording, which took place in July and August, became a temporary truce. The record opened with John Lennon's bluesy "Come Together."
Hold your filter, he said.
It was originally intended as a slogan for California gubernatorial candidate Timothy Leary, but in the end became one of the band's last powerful strikes on the world charts. In addition, it was on this album that George Harrison finally matched Lennon and McCartney in songwriting weight, delivering Something and Here Comes the Sun.
Here comes the sun, I say.
August 20th, 1969 became the final point. On that day, the four of them worked in the studio together for the last time, finishing the mix of I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Symbolically, on the album cover, the group walks across the crosswalk away from the studio. Fans would later decode it as a signal of the inevitable split. On September 20th, 1969, John Lennon officially announced at a private band meeting that he was leaving. But Alan Klein and Paul McCartney convinced him to stay silent so they would not jeopardize a lucrative contract renegotiation with Capitol Records, which guaranteed them higher royalties. Lennon agreed and then flew to Toronto with Yoko Ono, creating the project Plastic Ono Band. Meanwhile, Dick James, without notifying John and Paul, sold his stake in Northern Songs to the conglomerate ATV. The musicians, who owned only 26% of their own catalog, tried to take control, but lost. Paul McCartney sank into a deep depression on his High Park farm in Scotland. He found a way out of the dead end by recording the solo album McCartney, on which he played every instrument himself. The album Let It Be, released in May 1970, became the final chord in the band's history. The title song was inspired by a dream Paul McCartney had, in which his late mother Mary came to him and spoke words of comfort. On December 31st, 1970, McCartney filed a lawsuit in London's High Court against the other three members to dissolve the partnership. The early 70s became a time of triumph for the Beatles' solo projects. George Harrison released the first triple solo album in history, All Things Must Pass, which topped the charts on both sides of the Atlantic. In 1971, John Lennon recorded the album Imagine, whose title track became an anti-war anthem. However, the same record also contained a venomous attack on Paul, the song How Do You Sleep, in which John sang that the only worthwhile thing McCartney had done was the song Yesterday. Paul responded by forming the band Wings, deciding to start from scratch by playing concerts in small venues for students and traveling in a van. Ringo Starr, whose film career was gaining momentum, released the solo album Ringo in 1973. All the former Beatles took part in its recording, making it the closest the band ever came to a reunion. The musicians' personal lives during this period were no less turbulent. Paul and Linda had daughters Mary and Stella, and later a son, James. Interestingly, McCartney adopted Linda's daughter from her first marriage, Heather, and gave her his last name. John and Yoko moved to New York, where Lennon came under full FBI surveillance because of his anti-government views. The official dissolution of the Beatles' partnership took place only on January 9, 1975, in London.
7 years of fame ended with 5 years of legal battles. That same year, Lennon became a father for the second time. After 3 unsuccessful attempts to carry a child, Yoko gave birth to a boy on October 9th, and they named him Sean. John tried to spend as much time as possible with his son, taking a creative break for the next 5 years. Meanwhile, George Harrison peacefully separated from Pattie Boyd and, in '78, married Mexican-born Olivia Arias, who became the mother of his only child, son Donnie. On December 8, 1980, the world froze. 5 shots near the archway of the upscale Dakota building in New York did not just end John Lennon's life. They destroyed an entire generation's hope for a Beatles reunion. John was killed by former Beatles fan Mark Chapman at the age of 40, just as he was experiencing a creative rebirth with the album Double Fantasy. His ashes were scattered in Central Park, where the Strawberry Fields Memorial later appeared.
Lennon's financial estate, estimated at $200 million, passed to Yoko Ono and their son Sean. This sparked a long conflict with John's first son, Julian, who had been practically written out of the will. Only in 1996, after 16 years of legal battles, did Julian reach an out-of-court settlement with Ono, receiving, according to various reports, around $30 million. For the remaining Beatles, John's death became a moment of bitter closeness. In 1981, George Harrison released All Those Years Ago, a song originally written for Ringo, but transformed into a requiem for Lennon. Starr and McCartney also took part in the recording, marking the first time the three had worked together since the breakup. The 80s became a time of stabilization for Ringo Starr. After separating from Maureen in '75, he married actress Barbara Bach in April 1981, after meeting her on the set of the film Caveman. But behind the facade of family happiness lay a serious addiction. For years, Ringo and Barbara struggled with alcoholism, living life in a black fog. The turning point came in 1988, when the couple went through detox in Arizona, and since then Ringo has been completely sober and a vegetarian. By the 2010s, his personal fortune had reached $300 million, making him the richest drummer in the world. In 1997, Paul McCartney was knighted, becoming Sir Paul. His financial empire, MPL Communications, grew through the purchase of music rights from other songwriters, but the loss of the Beatles' catalog continued to weigh on him. In 1998, his wife Linda died of breast cancer. Paul was devastated, but found comfort in music and his children. His later marriage to Heather Mills ended in 2008, with one of the most expensive divorces in British history, costing Paul £24.3 million, but at the same time giving him another daughter, Beatrice Millie, who was born in 2003. In 2011, McCartney found true peace in his marriage to American Nancy Chevelle. George Harrison spent the 90s at his Friar Park estate, gardening and producing films. In 1995, the three reunited for the Anthology Project, completing Lennon's demo recordings Free as a Bird and Real Love. But in 1999, George nearly suffered John's fate. A madman with a knife broke into his home and stabbed the musician more than 40 times.
I said, "Why are you locking the door?" I said, "Why? Because I'm afraid. That's why I'm locking the door." He said, No.
Sadly, in 2001, Harrison died of lung cancer. He left behind a fortune of $400 million, which he bequeathed to his wife, his son, and charitable foundations in different countries around the world.
The 21st century became the era of Justice's final triumph. In 1981, Paul and Yoko Ono's attempt to buy back the rights to the Beatles' song catalog failed. The then owner of the ATV conglomerate, Lou Grade, demanded around £20 million and flatly refused to sell the Beatles catalog separately from the songs of other artists. But in 1985, an unexpected player entered the field, Michael Jackson. He bought ATV for $47.5 million, effectively taking control of more than 200 songs by the Liverpool foursome. The irony of the situation was that it was Paul McCartney himself who, during their recent collaboration, had encouraged Michael to invest in music publishing. Jackson's move instantly cooled their friendship and became a long-lasting personal defeat for McCartney. Only in 2017, after nearly half a century of legal battles, Paul McCartney used American law to reach a confidential agreement with the rights holders and regained control of the Beatles' legacy. In May 2024, Paul officially became the first musician billionaire in British history. At the moment, his fortune is estimated at an incredible $1.2 billion. But what happened to those who were part of the Beatles only for a short time? Drummer Tommy Moore, who left the band after the difficult tour of Scotland, returned to a stable job as a forklift driver at a bottle factory and died in 1981 from a brain hemorrhage. After being fired from the band in 1962, Pete Best left music for 20 years to pursue a career as a civil servant in Liverpool.
The payment of multi-million-dollar royalties for the anthology album in 1995 secured him a comfortable old age and the chance to perform with his band, the Pete Best Band, right up until his official retirement in April 2025. The fate of Jimmy Nicol, who replaced the ill Ringo for 10 days of the world tour in 1964, turned out to be more dramatic. After a brief, dizzying success, he could not stay at the top, went bankrupt in 1965, and eventually left music for the home renovation business. Nicol became a recluse and avoided the press for decades. He was last seen in London in the early 2010s. Finally, Billy Preston, by the way, the only musician whose name was officially credited on a Beatles single, built a brilliant solo career and continued working with George and Ringo for many years, passing away in 2006 after a long battle with kidney disease. In November 2023, with the help of artificial intelligence, the band's last song, Now and Then, was released. Becoming a #1 hit 53 years after the group's breakup. Today, 85-year-old Ringo Starr lives in Beverly Hills and continues to release albums. The country record, Look Up, and the rock album, Long, Long Road. 83-year-old Paul McCartney has owned his mansion in St. John's Wood for more than 60 years and, like Ringo, is still in the game. In May 2026, he presented his 20th solo album, The Boys of Dungeon Lane. Inspired by memories of his childhood in Liverpool's Speke district, the album's landmark moment was the track, Home to Us. A duet by Paul and Ringo, proving that their bond remains unbreakable even after 7 decades. The Beatles have long been much more than just a band.
They are a vast economic and cultural ecosystem, from the museum in Liverpool and the airport named after John Lennon to endless reissues, each one storming the charts. And Sir Paul and Sir Ringo remain the last watchmen of an empire that once changed the world. And which song by the Fab Four remains the most important and beloved one for you personally? Write it in the comments, and we'll say goodbye until the next episodes.